Hello, 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 and welcome to an EDH Deck Tech. I am Framed Eddie. I've been playing Magic for nearly 20 years at this point, and I've been playing EDH for at least, oh man, since 2008, 2009 ish. And, over the time that I've been playing, Landfall in EDH has always been really strong, but I always had that issue of feeling like the deck pilots itself. So I set out to make Landfall fun to play again. There are some commanders that I tried to play. AC, Tyrant of Gyre Strait, Tatiova, Benthic Druid, Nakanzel, Current Conductor. All of these do landfall in one way or the other. Nakanzel focuses on exploring, Tatiova is the classic, AC's Tatiova -1 life plus an additional land per turn. But the issue when you look at a bunch of Simic Landfall commanders is that they all have giant targets on their back. The console becomes a threat if left alone because of the explorability, and you have way less control over when you play lands and when you draw cards because Explorer is putting them to your hand, and you're either putting that into the graveyard or putting it in your hand. Tatiova literally just passively rewarding you for playing a land, so you're incentivized to just turbo out lands as fast as possible. And AC does the same thing, except for she lets you also play a land each turn, and she's more threatening than Tatiova. Enter Zimone, Quandrix Prodigy. Zimone has two Lands Matters abilities, with one being for 1 mana. You can tap her and put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. And the second, for 4, you can tap her, draw a card, and if you control 8 or more lands, you can draw 2 cards instead. She only costs 2 mana. She's a 1/2 human wizard, uncommon from Strixhaven. Super low threat level, super cheap to cast, and she's an active commander. And now you're asking, what makes a commander active, right? So, active commanders, as I define them, allow you to control when you spend and gain resources. Typically, they'll have activated or triggered abilities that cost a form of resource and reward in a different one. And 3, which is I think the most important part when it comes to this landfall equation, is that they don't reward you for just taking basic game actions on their own. Some examples of active commanders: Jan Jansen, sack an artifact creature, make 2 treasures, sack a non-creature artifact like a treasure, make 2 creature artifact tokens that you can sack for 2 treasures. Ashnod, Flesh Mechanist. You have to sack another creature, you get a tapped Power Stone in return. Then you have that new resource, and you're going to use Power Stones to do whatever you want to do with them. Rith is one that whenever you deal combat damage to a player, you have to pay 3, and if you do, you put a 1/1 green sapperling onto the battlefield for each permanent that's a color that you choose. So like it incentivizes multicolor plays, being able to like play towards the pod that has a bunch of different like 1/1s, so you can match the amount of 1/1s. The bottom row, same type of stuff. Feldegriff lets you do stuff for your opponents for mana, which is interesting. Ovia Pashiri, make a servo based on the number of creatures you control, or a colorless construct, both of which kind of help itself out, and you have to like choose when you're doing these things. One of the classics, Jaya Ballard. She's a spell shaper, so basically she turns a card into a classic Magic card. Her first ability, obviously, being the red elemental or blue elemental blast. So, giving the player control over when exactly the exchange of resources happens, and also it gives the opponents clear ways to prevent those resources from accumulating. So for a Rith, say you're playing against a Rith the Awakener, and it's turned like 7, you have nothing on the board, there was just a board wipe, they've played out Rith, You have 3 cards in hand. One's a green creature, 2 of them are blue creatures, one's a red creature because you're playing Teamer for some reason. Maybe you don't play both the red creatures so that Rith doesn't have as easy of a time building the board back up immediately. Maybe you just play the blue creature and then you can establish your board after Rith's been removed. Stuff like that lets your opponent take an active choice in counterplaying, even if it's not just strictly removal. That's something I really like about active commanders. So if there's active commanders, then there's obviously also passive commanders. In my opinion, passive commanders reward the player for passive game actions. Changing phase, playing a land. A lot of times they're both the enabler and the payoff, which is something people complain about a lot online. It's something I complain about a lot whenever I'm looking at a commander. I don't want the deck to pilot itself. And that's one of the major things that will make a deck pilot itself. And they're often seen as serious threats to be dealt with immediately, and justifiably so, because they'll take over a game from that resource accumulation. Some examples of passive commanders. Azusa, she's an enabler, can play 2 additional lands. All fine and dandy, but it's turn 4 and you have 9 lands in play, and all you've done is play your commander and had a handful of lands. Can kind of be rough for the rest of the table. Sithis, another classic, completely enables the strategy. You just cast an enchantment, draw a card, cast an enchantment, draw a card, cast an enchantment, draw a card. Tatyova, you play a land, draw a card. You play Azusa, then you play 3 lands, you draw 3 more cards, which gives you more lands that you can play. Yeva, similar. You can cast green creatures as though they had flash. Without her out, none of your stuff really has flash, so there's no reason for the table to let Yeva stay on the battlefield ever. The Gaffer, a lot worse, quality-wise on this, but it is still passive, because at the beginning of each end step, to gain 3 life, draw a card. So you're obviously going to be building around gaining 3 life so that you can draw a card as many turns as possible, which is going to lead to ooh, maybe we can't let you have the cards, so we need to remove your commander, and then remove your enablers, and then remove all this other nonsense. Adrix and Nev, another example of this type of thing where it can't stay on the battlefield, because that'll be bad for the table whenever you make any big token. So, all of these have that same, passivity in common. Zimone, Quandrix Prodigy, our commander that we've chosen, as an example of an active commander, phenomenal, right? You get to choose when you're playing the extra land, you get to choose when you're drawing the cards. It, compared to Tatyova, I have infinitely more choices as the pilot of this deck per turn. Do I want to spend the 4 mana to draw 2 cards right now, or do I want to hold up interaction and then do it on someone's end step? Zimone having, 3 cards, I think she has 4 now actually, but recently got another 2, both in Foundations and Duskmourn Commander, with the Mystery Unraveler, completely passive. You play a land, you manifest Dread. Second time you do it, you flip over a guy. Zimone Paradox Sculptor, on the other hand, beginning of combat, you put a 1/1 on up to 2 targets you control. And then for a green and a blue, you can double the number of each kind of counter on up to 2 targets. So the whole gameplay loop there is a couple of 1/1 counters, 2 mana, that couple turns into 4, that 4 turns into 8, that 8 turns into 16, which, awesome. It's like a Varela the Hulkblade, but it also gives the counters on its own. And that's what I would call a hybrid, where it does something that you can build around and you get to choose when you're going to do that, but also it has that passive trigger of at the beginning of the combat on your turn, put a 1/1 counter. So now that we've gotten the active and passive commander thing out of the way, let's look at Zimone. So Zimone Quandrix Prodigy. She's a 2 mana, legendary creature, human wizard. We've talked about her abilities already. what are we looking for in the 99 of one of a deck for her? Um, so her second ability, draw a card. If you control 8 or more lands, you draw 2 cards instead. We want quick ways to get to 8 lands because drawing 2 cards is good. She's only a 1/2. She costs 2 mana. Not hard to replay, but she's not really a threat. She's not going to build herself into a threat like Hybrid Zimone can. And she's not going to like cheat a threat into play like Manifest Zimone can. So we need some sort of substantial late game threat that can get us over the finish line. Also notably, her second ability costs 4 mana. Interactive spells that cost 4 or more are going to be like interaction, like counter spells. We're going to be able to have that up because we're going to be holding the 4 mana to be able to draw 2 cards at the end of something if we don't need the interaction. So it really gives us an option select if we play interaction that costs 4 or more, which also gives us access to a lot of really interesting interaction, which we'll go over a little bit later. And the worst part about Simic Landfall is that it's such a supported archetype that there are just like objectively good things you could do with Landfall that I'm going to try to avoid mostly because I don't want it to feel like every other generic Simic Landfall deck went to EDH Rec and got the top 100 cards, right? That's not what I'm looking for personally when it comes to a commander. So, let's talk about finding a unique niche in landfall strategies. What does landfall do for us? Gives us a lot of mana, gives us landfall triggers, and then we have a general imbalance in resources with our opponents. We're going to have more lands, we're going to have more mana, we're going to have more things that we can do with each of our cards than most of our opponents. And then let's look at Zimone as a whole. What uniqueness does she bring? She's from Strixhaven, which means that that's the set we're obviously going to start looking in. She's also from Quandrix College, which is the Simic subset of Strixhaven, which gives us a whole other set of cards to look at inside Strixhaven and Commander 2021, among other products that have random cards that feature Quandrix College deans and other characters from the lore there. We also have that 4 mana sweet spot of mana to leave open for option select interaction like I talked about before. And we have recently been given a new version and new related cards in Duskmourn because Zimone's on Duskmourn for some reason. I don't know, I didn't read those. So, let's start looking at it. What does Strixhaven and a lot of mana together give us? Bookworm, Jadzi, and Mascot Exhibition are the 3 most expensive spells within Simic Color Identity in Strixhaven. Mascot Exhibition gives us some tokens. That's cool, I guess. Jadzi just helps us play more lands, and by the time that we're at 8 mana, do we really want to be playing more lands? I'm not really sure. And then there's Bookworm. Bookworm is an 8 mana, 7/7 worm with trample that whenever it enters the battlefield, you gain 3 life and you draw a card. And for 3 mana, you can put it from your graveyard into the library, 3rd from the top. You know, not the best recursion, but it is a late game threat. Like, you know, we got something to work with here. So let's go down the Bookworm rabbit hole. I guess it's a wormhole. Working with what we got. Bookworm's a worm. He has wonky recursion. I like Bookworm a lot. I think it's a really cool card, just in general, especially at an uncommon, and you're not going to see people playing Bookworm out and about at your LGS normally. It's good enough to get the job done at the end if we have some way to multiply it, some sort of way to enhance this threat. And Simic happens to be really good at clones and copy spells. Out of the two, clones being a creature versus copies being some sort of uh, instant or sorcery most of the time, makes makes it feel like I should play the copy spells because Quandrix in Strixhaven had a lot of magecraft abilities. So I'm like, okay, copy spells plus worms, that feels very Quandrix, that feels very Strixhaven, that feels very Zimone. Cool. So we have our top end idea now. Let's look at the other worms. So looking at other worms, there's not a lot of them. There's not a lot of them in Simic. But there's like some pretty good ones. We got Worm Coil Engine, we got World Spine Worm, we got Penumbra Worm, and Symbiotic Worm. All of which big beaters, keywords minus the Symbiotic Worm. But whenever they die, we get to put creature tokens into play, so they're board wipe protection built in. That's awesome. Um, and the other cool thing, if we're going with the copy spells, which is what we're thinking right now, is we only need one real one on the field, and then we can copy this, 4 or 5 times. Rite of Replication, we get 5 copies of World Spine Worm out. Even if the board gets wiped, that's still a board at the end of the day. Panglacial Worm lets us turn all that ramp that we're going to be playing, because we are playing Simic Landfall still, into a late game tutor and 9/5 with Trample that will then copy spell. So Panglacial Worm just being on deck basically the whole game, kind of good. That's kind of like a good idea. And then there's a couple of worms that fit into the lower end of our strategy too. Beanstalk Worm and the Sorcery Adventure Plant Beans, being an Explorer, and then a 5/4 with Reach. Don't have a lot of ways to deal with flyers. Having an Explorer that's also a worm is on theme, that can deal with flyers, and in a pinch is a late game beater with nothing else on the board. We can take the slot for Beanstalk Worm. Cool. So worms, copy spells. Pretty sick idea so far. What else do we got to look at? So we know we're looking for copy spells. We're still looking for quick ways to get to 8 lands. We're still looking at our interaction, and we're still looking for that unique identity within the generic Simic Landfall idea. So I would say the worms kind of get about 50% of that. That's what people are going to remember from the end of the game whenever you are winning. It's just the big worms hitting them. That's people look at a game of Commander and they're like, "Oh, okay. Yeah, I remember you played that like giant worm deck that just absolutely blah blah blah." They don't remember the, "Oh yeah, you played Kodama's Reach into Cultivate, into Exploration, into uh what's one of the big landfall guys? Cultivator Colossus." They don't remember that, but they would remember, "Oh hey, these janky worms I haven't ever seen outside of Worm Coil Engine and World Spine Worm are just like absolutely beating my face in right now." So let's continue on our 99. And let's talk about interaction. An uninteractive deck is never fun. I don't want to sit here and play solitaire. I don't want to go all the way to the LGS, unpack my bag, unroll my playmat, and sit down and not cast spells against someone else. If I wanted to play solitaire, I would stay at home. That being said, a deck that uses like the super staple interaction, Creme de la Creme, Cyclonic Rift, Path to Exile, Swords, like your Disenchant, all of the stuff that people play a ton of because it's the most efficient and it's the easiest to just toss in. You don't have to do any building around. It feels like it could be any deck at that point, and interaction is one of those things that whenever you're playing against your opponent, that's the part that like touches their things, which makes them remember those spells more than what you're doing on your own board. That's why creatures are so memorable. That's why end-game like finishers are so memorable, is because that's where the touch points between the players are. So interaction that feels generic, makes your deck feel more bland to your opponents than using super staples in the ramp parts of your deck does. Which is why I decided that I was going to focus on putting the interaction side of it together in a more unique way. So, let's start looking at our options between Zimone, Strixhaven, and strictly Simic Guild on Ravnica. I'll go about why the strictly Simic Guild on Ravnica spells in a bit, but it's mainly because we're in the colors. Let's be honest. Cool. So, Strixhaven option. Aether Helix. Return a permanent to its owner's hand. Return a permanent from your graveyard to your hand. It's regrowth plus a bounce. Not a bad card. Kind of decent. It is a sorcery, though, which makes me not like it as much. Quandrix command. Zimone front and center. That's awesome. That feels very available for the flavor. It's a charm spell, so you get to choose two. It can either counter an artifact or an enchantment. It can return a creature or planeswalker to its owner's hand. It lets you shuffle up to 3 target cards from a graveyard into a library, or put 2 1/1 counters on target creature. I think this spell's awesome. It's not a hard counter. It can deal with 4 different types of permanents, and it can deal with cards in the graveyard. Just absolute all-star of options, even if they're not all the best options. Decisive Denial. We got Zimone on the board again. Fight spell. Counters a non-creature spell unless they pay 3. People tap out a lot in Commander. And having this option to either counter a non-creature spell or fight a creature, especially when we're going to be having 9/5, 7/7, 6/6s with Death Touch worms, kind of good. Awesome spell. Instant speed 2 mana below our 4 mana threshold. Super sick. And then we got Perplexing Text. Quandrix themed. Instant speed board wipe for either creature tokens or non-token creatures. This is really cool with our idea of copy spells, because our board's not going to be completely wiped whenever we rip a copy spell and have 2 or 3 copies of a creature, and we'll get our big original beater back to hand. It's instant speed. It costs 5 mana. We're going to be holding up 4 a lot of the time to be able to draw 2 cards with Zimone anyways. I think that's a home run. Let's keep going. Some of the Simic ones, Repudiate/Replicate. Not only is this a niche counterspell that lets us target a activated or triggered ability which people do not run enough interaction for, it's also a copy spell. Hard not to include. Just the versatility in our deck is going to be excellent with that. Aggressive Biomancy. It's a copy spell, but it's also a mass fight spell. So whenever we make, let's say we pay 3 for the X, so a total of 8 mana on our turn, very doable in Simic. We make 3 copies of a worm and then make it fight the 3 biggest, baddest creatures on the battlefield. Kind of good. And then we just got in Duskmourn Commander, Zimone's Hypothesis. Flavor, win. And then we can put a 1/1 counter on target creature, then choose odd or even, and return each creature with the power of the chosen quality to its owner's hand. 0 is even. So, going back to our copy spell idea with the worms, if we're playing 1 worm, and then we're copy spelling that worm so that we have 2, 3, 4 copies of the same worm, they all have the same power. They won't have modified power. So we can put that 1/1 counter on an opponent's creature that happens to be on the right side and just wipe that problem creature away, along with a bunch of other stragglers, and then still have our entire big worm wall. Pretty good. Going through this some more, some of the Simic ones. Repulsive Mutation, we got big guys, counterspell for 2, or we can buff a creature plus a counterspell. Pretty good. Void Slime counters anything. It's in Simic, and it's hard to beat. Plasm Capture, it's mana drain, but for 4 mana, and we're holding 4 mana up for Zimone anyways. So 4 mana, 20-cent mana drain, hard to argue with. And then we have Oversimplify, which is probably the hardest Simic board wipe I've seen. Exile all creatures. Each player makes a 0/0 token and puts a number of 1/1 counters on it equal to the power of creatures they exile this way. So, even if we're having to take some stray hits, we're going to have some big guys. And being able to churn those out, making the copies, and it exiles all creatures on the board, we can really catch someone overextending with this, and then someone else will probably deal with their 70/70 after they've wiped their entire board of things. So looking pretty good so far on the interaction options. The other thing about Strixhaven is the mystical archives. So looking through Simic interaction as a whole, there's a couple of gaps. We haven't got enough artifact or enchantment removal. If we wanted to play more counter spells, we have these 4 options, which are all classics: Memory Lapse, Negate, Counterspell, Whirlwind Denial. But these are the options that exist within the Mystical Archives, which, for flavor reasons, playing a Strixhaven character helmed deck, I think, is a much better use of a slot than some other generic counterspell or Crossing Grip type spell. It feels a little like a cop out on some of it, but I am running at least Crossing Grip within the 99 of the deck because we did need an extra artifact or enchantment removal spell. But, we have the options there if we want to expand on that later. So, we've got all the way to just looking for quick ways to get 8 lands, and we got to our copy spells. So, we've stayed on flavor for our interaction. We're worming. What's left? I'm not going to bore you with the land ramp section of the deck. We're going to run 40 lands at least. Cultivate, Kodama's Reach, Growth Spire, Eureka Moment, Planar Genesis, Farseek, 3 Visits, Nature's Lore. You've seen every other green-blue deck ever made. The deck list is going to be in the bio. You can look at it later. Obviously using our Eureka Moment because Zimone's on it, and it's 4 mana and an instant. Pretty good. So let's go to the copy spells. Pictured here is Rite of Replication. It's a classic. 4 mana plus 5 more mana. 5 copies of any creature. Pretty sick. How many copy spells do we realistically need, though? We have 9 big worms in the list. Realistically, we only are going to rip a big copy spell once or twice in a game. So I was thinking 5 to 8 seemed like a good, reasonable goal to aim for without detracting and having copy spells just rotting in my hand. So let's look at the pure copy spell options. Cackling Counterpart, 3 mana. It's an instant. It has flashback for 7. Awesome to do that on someone's instep. Even more fun to rip it the second time because we had 4 mana up to draw 2 cards with Zimone anyways. And we had an extra 3 laying around because we're Simic, we've made a lot of lands. Rite of Replication, another classic. 5 copies of the thing. Doppelgang, very cool spell. We get to target multiple permanents and make multiple copies of multiple permanents. There is a really funny infinite combo in here where for a measly 17 mana, we can target a Eternal Witness and 4 lands basically to tap for 4 mana and make 5 copies of each. And with that, one of the Eternal Witnesses returns the Doppelgang to your hand. You have enough mana to Doppelgang again, making another copy of it, returning 4 more things from your graveyard. So that is like an alternate win con. It is 17 mana. That's not going to happen anytime soon within the game. But man, if you need like the worst out of your life, Doppelgang plus Eternal Witness. What a cool little interaction piece there. And then we have some dual use copies. For the common good, I had this laying around. We get to make copies of tokens, and they get to be indestructible. It's Heroic Intervention, 4 tokens. Season of Weaving. Well, it's until my next turn, so it's preemptive Heroic Intervention. Not as good, but you know. Season of Weaving. It can draw us 5 cards. It can make 2 copies of something and draw a card. It can make a copy of our big threat and then return all the non-land, non-token permanents to hand. Absolutely awesome. Aggressive Biomancer, we've already talked about. Copy plus a board wipe. Well, not like a board wipe, but copy plus removal. And then we got Echoing Equation. It's from Strixhaven. We choose a creature we control. Each other creature becomes a copy until end of turn. If you remember back to Symbiotic Worm, whenever Symbiotic Worm dies, it makes 7/1/1 insects. 7/1/1 insects aren't very scary in our deck, but we can, with this only being 5 mana, we can cast another large creature and then make them all that large creature, and they don't have summoning sickness because they've been out since the last time the board got wiped. And on top of that, on the other side of Echoing Equation, is Augmenter Pugilist, who is a 3/3 with Trample Troll Druid from Strixhaven. As long as you control 8 or more lands, it gets +5/+5. That's very easily an 8/8 in our deck because we're aiming to get 8 lands as quickly as possible. Having that as a second option, still on theme, that we can rip our copy spells onto, or it's a copy spell on its own for like a post-board wipe world. Absolutely phenomenal inclusion in here. And then we go back to our dual use copy with Replicate, 3 mana, copy spell, sorcery speed, awesome. Repudiate, being able to counter target activated or triggered ability. That can, something like that can win you a game because it can catch someone off guard. They're about to ult their Planeswalker, counter it. Pretty sick. Cool. So that's basically the general idea of the deck. Landfall's plagued with passive value and generic payoffs. Simic Interaction has a lot of stuff going for it, and having access to all this mana means you can run a ton of interesting, cheap, interactive spells. And one big threat copied 5 times is 4 cards more efficient than having 5 separate big threats. So being able to use one thing multiple times because of the copy spells, because of us bouncing things, ends up working out pretty well. I've played this a few times so far, had a great time. So if you have any comments, complaints, or snide remarks, leave those below, and subscribe if you want more random videos about shit I'm interested to. I'm Frame Daddy, and I'm out of here.